thank you very much for having me and inviting me, and of course, congratulations to making it to 50, both to the University of Bielefeld and Julian. And as Tobias just said, I'm going to step away a little bit from the question of whether we need grand theories or what the theories should be about, and look at the relation of theoretical thinking with the neighboring form of sociological thought, which I would call diagnostic thought. And roughly you could say until the 1980s, general theorizing and the diagnosis of contemporary social dynamics were in very intertwined sociological task, like especially when you go even further back to the classics and founders of our disciplines, you will have very sort of shifting mode of writing about theoretical abstract concepts on the one hand, and very present issues and questions about the social condition of the present. And during the last 3 or 4 decades, theorizing and diagnosis of society became, you could say, 2 accentuated modes of knowledge production. While theorizing turned into an increasingly, I would say, specialized and abstract endeavor, diagnosing evolved into the most popular form of sociological writing. And this sort of development was met with a very, you could say, critical suspicion by the theoretical university, aka the professionalized core of the discipline. Some commentators advocated for a sharp distinction between general academic theories and sociological texts concerned with contemporary issues and written for a broader public. Yet, I would argue, and I will try to show this today, the conjunction of both genres of sociological thought never really ceased to exist completely. And during the last couple of years, I would even say we have a recent boom of diagnostic publications that is not met by a boom of sociological theory publications. And this boom, I would say, indicates not only a quantitative shift of balance between diagnostic and theoretical knowledge production, but it's also, I would say, driven by new forms of diagnostic writing, which I will come to in the second part of my presentation. So just to give you a brief impression of what I'm talking about, these are titles that I would file under diagnosis of the present. And you can see there's a very early example, Daniel Bell, and then the notorious Grist Society we already mentioned here today. And I just picked some examples that are very popular on the one side, and on the other side all have the term society in the title, which gives you already a clue for a first genre convention that these books tend to address the whole of society, maybe in the nationalist sense we just heard about. I will come back to this later. This development, I would say, and you can see there are very recent examples, and we had a lot of, especially in Germany, a lot of publications in this vein in the last couple of years. Also, there's Cornelia Koppitsch, Gesellschaft des Zorns, and we discussed this a lot in the last weeks because of intellectual property issues, and I don't want to get into this, but what is interesting about this discussion is that you can see this genre also, I would say, becomes more and more self-referential. Like these diagnoses sort of react to each other more and more, and they reference each other more and more, maybe not always in the proper way, but that's a totally different debate. I would say this development calls for a readjustment of the genre-defining features, and I will talk about this readjustment with regard to another vein of recent publications in the second part, and a re-evaluation of its theoretical potential. And I will try today to make some proposals for such a readjustment, and I will develop this argument in 3 steps. I will first introduce to you both forms of communications as genres, you could say, using 2 successful export products, you might say, of the Theoretical University in Bielefeld, differentiation theory, and corresponding concepts of public understanding of science research that were also conducted here. And I will argue for a closer understanding of possible contemporary connections and constellations between both and map out these constellations. And then I will take a closer look, as I said, on recent popularity of diagnoses and readjust the established genre definition towards a less theoretical and more descriptive form, and yet still ask for the theoretical potential of this readjustment. So, differentiation theorists like André Kieserling, Fran Osretzky, also Uwe Schimank and Ute Volkmann distinguished theoretical and diagnostic sociological writings by their internal and external function in academic communication. And this is a very black and white, sort of sketchy distinction I'm presenting to you here. It's, of course, a much more nuanced discussion going on, but this is for the sake of the argument here. And sociological theory serves a primarily internal function in the field of sociology. It's responsible for conceptual groundwork. You turn to theory when you want to find out more about the terms and the systematization of the terms you are working with as a sociologist. It provides an analytical framework for empirical research and empirical questions, not always like in the strict sense of hypothesis formulation you can then test, but still sociological theory always sort of has to have connection points into empirical debates and applications in sociology. And and it also asked of sociology, of theoretical thinking, to sort of integrate the specialized fields of sociological research, like, for example, provide a concept of inequality that people can agree upon who work on very different empirical fields, like sociology of family, of education systems, and so on. Finally, and probably most important, the audience and the reception of sociological theory is an internal, professional, academic audience. So this is not something that is written for people outside of the profession, even though, of course, everyone can read anything, but I think it's not a coincidence that reading like tough theoretical book is not a very common hobby. On the other side, you have those genre of diagnosis of the presence. These are the titles you had on the first slide. And they, on the opposite, serve an external function. They are sort of responsible for the translation or communication of sociological knowledge, and this includes theoretical knowledge, into the public sphere. So this is very close to Burrows' concept of public sociology we have discussed a lot in the last years. And they are written for an extra academic audience. So they are not written for professionalized reception, but for broader publics, and they are also marketed and published in a very different way. These different functions I just sketched sort of feed in or run into different, is this the right slide? Yeah, different forms of knowledge and a different form of style in the presentation of the argument. Sociological theory, you could say, has a very strong focus on continuity. It stretches over large historical phases, on general applicability, and on long-term development. Like if you have a theory of modernization in sociological theory, you can easily cover a couple of centuries and have evolutionary models where you have only like 3 phases, but they cover a very, very broad time span. They work with very abstract and universal concepts, and the presentation of the arguments normally is very reflexive and relational in a way. So there are pros and cons, and you cite maybe opposite arguments, and you try to sort of make very clear where you stand in the field of sociological theory production, what you write against, what are your blind spots, where there could be connection points to other theoretical debates, and so on. So a very nuanced and reflexive way of writing. And this comes together with a very specialized language. So probably everyone at some point had this experience who studied sociology, that you get into a new theoretical field and it feels like you have to learn a whole new vocabulary. It's like a totally different language from what you use as a general language, and people then complain about someone writing too complicated or the terms being too complicated and so on. That's a pretty common discussion we have in theory classes, but also among colleagues from time to time. With the diagnosis of the presence, you have a very different form of knowledge presentation and also a very different style of writing. There's no focus on long-term evolutionary developments, for example, but the focus is always on novelty. Though something new is happening, the times they are changing. Stefan just said that this indicates sort of a diagnostic knowledge that is communicated, and this is very typical for diagnostic writing. And this new is not something that sort of evolves organically out of the old, but there is usually an idea of disruption. And the present condition is totally different from what has happened before, and that's why we need a new book about it, or even a new term for the society we live in. So the social change communicated here is sort of communicated as news. It has newsworthiness and is using strategies you will normally find more in mass media communication. Like something that is reportable, that is a very dramatic event, and has to be reported. So the style in these books normally is more essayistic. You will find not such a specialized language as you will find in theory books. You will find a lot of personalization and exemplification in the argument, not in a very strict professional empirical sense, but often more anecdotal in a way. And you will have a very clear-cut, sort of even black and white presentation of arguments. Also, the focus typically is on a singular specificity. Like the present condition is totally influenced by a new form of dealing or becoming aware of risks, was the thesis back, was so popular with when he came up with the risk society term. Or all social relations are now transformed into bringing forth singularity of individuals in society. So these books are very strongly focused on this one very clear-cut argument, and they do not really take a lot of time to make concessions related, weigh pro and cons, but have strong theses, very clear, strong theses. Also, they often centered around a very overgeneralized yet underdefined object, and this usually is society as a whole, as you could see in all these titles. Risk society, individualized society, externalization society. Usually you will not find much reflection in the books which society these books are actually talk about. They seem to be built on a very commonsensical definition of society, which comes with all the strings attached we just heard about, that usually in our common understanding, this is the national society we happen to live in. And sociology, as you heard in the first two presentations, has some problems with this commonsensical concept of society. These differences, as I sketched them out just briefly, often lead to criticism towards popular diagnoses, for overemphasizing genre markers like newsworthiness as alarmism, non-specialized language as unscientific, and monofocal argumentation as oversimplification, detached from empirical and theoretical complexity and ambivalence. Despite this very critical stance towards popular diagnosis, their function as important sociological voices in broader public debates is widely recognized, you could say. Peter Burroway's intervention for a conscious division of sociological labor, for example, placed books like Beck's Risk Society or many of Zygmunt Baumann's or Anthony Giddens' later writings in the hedged quadrant of public sociology, while theorizing in Burroway's model is seen as a either professional or critical sociological practice. Yet, interconnections and overlaps between theory and diagnosis occur on a regular basis. And in the debates, also in the sociology of knowledge field, you usually find three types of relationships that are distinguished on the basis of the assumed genre division. First, you have this idea of sort of a subsequent complementarity, so that existing general sociological findings and concepts inform diagnostic writing and are popularized in the process, like concepts of individualization, class, inequality, and so on. So here you have the strong idea of diagnosis as tools of translation of specialized, very opaque knowledge into the public realm. The second constellation, and this is a point the authors of these diagnostic books very often make, is one of circular complementarity. So here we have this idea of an entanglement of theoretical and diagnostic concept, like, for example, singularity or externalization. So there is a theoretical term or concept that starts to emerge from the diagnosis as a sort of hybrid, more sensitive, more experimental arena of theorizing. So this form of writing, then as said, gives you sort of more room to wiggle, to find out, to come up with new ideas that might translate into theoretical concept. And the last point, just very briefly, that was brought up by Fran Osrecki recently, is substitution. So the fear or the threat that the replacement of theoretical concepts by diagnostic concepts might happen, especially in subfields with little theoretical orientation. So in fields that are highly empirically coined, there is this tendency, at least this is Fran's thesis, that they tend to avoid sociological theory as sort of reference or framing device, and typically put in the introductory parts of their studies references to diagnostic writing. I'm not sure if that's a solid judgment, but still there is this discussion going on whether diagnostic writing is more of a sort of threat for theoretical thought. I'm not going deeper into this. The categories and systematization I introduced so far are heavily influenced by the public and professional reception, you could say, of titles from the early peak of dominantly diagnostic book in the 1980s, if you remember this slide. And in Germany, this is especially Beck's Risikogesellschaft. This became also for this kind of reflection on this genre, a sort of ideal type in this vein of writing, both for sociologists of knowledge who studied diagnostic writing as an object, and for prospective authors and publishers who modeled books and marketing strategies after this extremely successful predecessor. So in recent years, a plethora of diagnostic publication has surfaced, many of them very successful regarding media, reception, and sales and so on, like Gesellschaft der Singularitäten, Abstiegsgesellschaft and so on. And while, especially in Germany, many of these books use the genre markers I just described above as argumentative and also stylistic blueprints, a different trend, I would say, emerged simultaneously. And especially in the US, but also in France, the most popular sociological books read by large non-academic audiences are not diagnoses in the way I just described them to you, but a sort of ethnographic or quasi-ethnographic studies or contain ethnographic or sometimes even autobiographic elements. So just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, these are 5 examples of books that received a very broad public reception. Werron, which was originally published already 2009, but in Germany really took off after it was published. I think it was 2016. Then we have Alice Goffman's On the Run, an ethnography of gangs in Chicago, Ali Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, Matthew Desmond, Evicted, also an ethnographic study on eviction practices targeted primarily at Afro-American women. And just out this year, Steffen Mau, Lüttenklein, a diagnostic book about GDR housing project in Rostock, where Steffen Mau himself, was living as a child. All these titles function in the diagnostic way I just described. So the function, in the discourse they fulfill is this of the diagnoses I just introduced. They were not only read as fascinating but singular case studies, but sparked lively debates about the present condition of society and its ills. Desmond's Evicted and Goffman's On the Run became witnesses for the conjunction of race, poverty, and criminalization as a contemporary signature of the US-American society. And Eribon's autobiographical account, or Ali Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, were not only read as quasi-ethnographic studies of interesting local phenomena, but as timely explanations for the decline of left-wing or liberal party support among middle and lower class, working class people. So how do we have to readjust the genre debate I just introduced? I think the strengths of this very recent trend in diagnostic writing lie in the personification and dramatization of well-established theoretical concepts like, for example, a labeling approach, class theory, or social shame, or symbolic capital. They show no interest in inventing new labels or coining new terms, but apply existing, very plain, very basic theoretical categories within very thick, very dense, very subjective descriptions of social realities. In that regard, they seem to follow an intervention Beth, Briss, and Kahn made in 2017 when they published a plea for less theory, more description. But the absence of theoretical knowledge in those texts is only superficial. The depicted individual struggles function like, you could say, sort of canvases. In the process of the thick description, structural and social forces appear on those canvases as a way of, you could then imagine as a central scaffolding of the narration. Charles Wright Mill's definition of sociological imagination comes to mind with his proclaimed aim that sociology should express a feeling for the sociological features of men's fate in our time. And I think this is pretty much what these kind of books do by really focusing in. They are not focusing in on those individual biographies. So maybe Mills might serve as a tacit predecessor of these diagnostic sociological approaches we find in these books. Focusing on personification and radical intersubjectivity, abstract social concepts like class, race, precarity are communicated less through newsworthiness, as it is the case with this other model of diagnostic writing, but through identification and sympathy. Diagnoses in this tradition are much less likely to substitute theoretical knowledge or claim theoretical innovation like the type 2 and type 3 constellation I described above, but they also differ from the first type, since they do not simply sort of translate specific abstract concepts into an easier, more approachable language. Their genuine contribution in public debates lies, I would say, in a theoretical, informed, yet highly relatable knowledge about present social ills and forces that shape individual lives. All these books do so with a focus, and that's a sort of, I would say, a shortcoming of these books. All these books do so with a focus on rather homogeneous groups. So you have a study of female Afro-American renters with low incomes who are threatened by eviction, or you have interviews with Middle West working class families in Ali Hochschild's book, or you have this depiction of East German living realities from an even specific GRD housing project in the northeast German town of Rostock, as in Lüttenklein. So these are very specific yet very homogeneous groups that sort of appear as characters in these studies. This allows the reader to identify more easily with a maybe unknown or strange social position, so you learn something about a life world that might be very strange to you. But it also reduces a very complex net of dependencies and structures to a singular social standpoint. Even, and here is Werron probably the most telling case, to a singular concrete biography. And this brings in new questions, and I can't answer them here. Maybe we come back to this in the discussions, but I will come to some alternatives we find maybe when we look at other disciplines. What we can already see, I would say, the different theory diagnosis constellation we find in the recent tide of also ethnographic sociological bestsellers needs further examination. They work differently than the older reflections on diagnosing, suggest, and come with new strings attached and introduce new limitations. A functional analysis of the relationship between theoretical and diagnostic knowledge in sociology should reformulate the genre concept introduced above towards a wider understanding of diagnostic writing. Moving on from the doubtlessly influential ideal type position Beck's Risk Society takes in this discourse allows for a better understanding of recently extremely popular forms of diagnostic writing and their potential for theorizing in sociology. And what I will do now, and I will be very brief because you are probably thirsty and in need of a break, I will conclude with a short outlook on that potential. So what can be gained from engaging with this kind of different form of diagnostic writing from a theoretical perspective. And I will do so by bringing something or introducing something to you that could be, you could call like two best practice examples from other fields, from other disciplines. And I think sociological theory can gain much from the renaissance of ethnographic and quasi-ethnographic diagnostic writing if we focus not only on the singular outcomes, on homogeneous groups, on very specific case studies, but widen our view and try to come up with new forms of including a plurality of voices. And these are two books who do this pretty well, I would say, who were also bestsellers in their fields, and they do it in a very, very different way from the sociological books I just introduced to you. In 2016, Anat Singh published The Mushroom at the End of the World, an ethnography of global commodity chains attached to the matsutake mushroom, which is a very rare, expensive gourmet food, which only grows in human disturbed forests. So you have to disturb forest and there has to be a sort of ecological imbalance, then this mushroom will grow, and people pay increasingly high amounts of money then to eat these mushrooms. She follows the object, so she uses the follow the object approach. She follows the mushroom, organized, and she shows how this sort of object and organizes a multitude of actors who are all involved around the mushroom and shows a global and ecological complexity in a very multifocal narrative. So in a way, you could say she is provincializing the narration of the global. She gives us an idea of global commodity chains, their ecological imprints, the actors involved, by following in very small, localized case studies the journey of the these mushrooms through the globe. A totally different approach we have in the book written by Jill Lepore that was just published this year, called These Truths. This is a variation, you could say, or Lepore's take on the probably most hegemonic format in history writing. She's a historian. One can think of. It's a national history of the United States. So this is a genre that is usually characterized, as a colleague from me in Essen, Sina Farzin, once said, by great male historians writing about great dead politicians doing great things, building a nation. This is how the genre usually works. But Lepore now retells this story of the building of the nation in the United States and the shaping of this nation by reflecting on institutional backgrounds. So this is a, so to say, traditional part of their book. And now, how is she doing it? Via a choir of different voices that are usually not present in such books. She lets talk slaves and slave traders, migrants, women, abolitionists, public servants who play a very little role, and goes into an oral history of the building of the United States. And they are not present as marginalized figures. This is not just a counter history now focusing on those who are usually excluded, but a choir of various voices retelling the known story in a now very unknown way. So in a way, what she's offering is a you could say, if you go to Stefan's presentation, she's democratizing the narration of the national or the national state. So she's trying to figure out a pluralistic way to narrate the becoming of a national state. So these are two examples. I just wanted to show them to you because we heard so much about we need other narrations and we have to come up with new narrations and maybe we should scale up and go into world or global theories of the social, and we should do so, but if we do so, we could use ideas like this who are actually scaling down, who are focusing in, and combining them to find new ways to narrate problems we have in sociological theory. It's an open question if this can or will work, I know, and how we can adapt such strategies. But I think if we really want to move forward with the globalization of sociological theory, and we heard two strong pleas for that today, and I think most sociologists in Bielefeld are totally on board with that endeavor, but we also have heard this for such a long time now, for a couple of decades, and we still didn't really, I think, come up with a convincing way to tell or reshape our main narratives. We might get new ideas from formal experiments like these. Thank you.